I'm an associate professor of history at Yale, and I'm the acting chair for the South Asian Studies Council. And we're really excited to have the series kick off with Dr. Tanya Bhattacharya, who is currently a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. She's a historian of modern South Asia and the Indian Ocean, and her work lies at the intersection of urban histories, histories of border, itinerancy, labor, capitalism, cinema, and popular culture. Her forthcoming book, Ocean Bombay, 1839-1945, Space, Itinerancy, and Community in an Imperial Port City, tells a century-long story of Bombay's spatial, economic, and socio-political transformation from a port city to a mill city. Through accounts of community building amongst itinerant transoceanic residents of the city, the book practices a critique of the methodological nationalism inherent in much intellectual inquiry about the subcontinent. Her work draws on multiple archives across this sort of transoceanic realm, ranging from Bombay, Birmingham, London to Tehran. Dr. Bhattacharya joined the Society of Fellows after receiving her PhD in history from Columbia University. She was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, reading history prior to that, and did her first BA from St. Stephen's College at the University of Delhi. Tanya, thank you so much for joining us, and we very much look forward to the talk. We will be taking questions at the end of the talk, and I'll be maintaining a queue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Professor Day, and many thanks to the Yale South Asia Council for having me here. I'm very delighted to be the first speaker of the season, I think. And this talk is mostly going to be based on me talking, not a lot of visual temptations, unfortunately, but I will start with a few photos to introduce you to the subject that I'm talking about. Just two clarifications. I am presenting my research of one chapter from my forthcoming book. I'll speak very briefly about the book project, but I'll delve right into the chapter soon enough. And secondly, it's social history combined with legal history. So it's the making of a community and the making of a border, and both of those two processes happening together. So there's a lot of detail. Anyone who's familiar with Mumbai will expect that level of almost dizzying social detail. So if all the terms and concepts are not immediately clear, bear with me, and I think a lot will become even clearer in the question and answer session. So let me quickly start with, I think I need to have screen sharing enabled, if that's possible.
Hi, Tanya, sorry. Ryan, could we give Tanya co-host access? You should be able to do this, Tanya. It allows, is there a screen sharing option?
Yes, it's working now.
Thank you. Thank
you so much. I think you should be able to see it now, but that's the title of my talk today. Mughals in Bombay. The question mark is because when you're associated with South Asia and you hear Mughals, you usually think of a ruling political dynasty, and the Mughals of this talk are not the same Mughals. And it's called Migration, Community, and Border Making in a Colonial Port City. So to come to the question of who are the Mughals, which is the central question this talk will keep returning to, I want to start with a few photos of mosques in Iran, actually. So that's a photo of the Jama Masjid in Isfahan. I expect the most striking thing about that facade is like the remarkable blue tile work. And that is something that continues in common with most of the mosques from the Safavid period in Isfahan. So the second photo is of Masjid-e-Sheikh Lutfullah, also in the Naqsh-e-Jahan Square in Isfahan. You will notice again the stunning blue tile work, the sort of honeycombed entranceway structure. All of these have technical names. I'm sure I'm not an architectural historian, but anyone seeing these images will notice the similarities. This photo is of Masjid-e-Shah, another mosque in the same square in Isfahan. Note the same detailed, incredible honeycomb structure of the entranceway architecture, the calligraphic ornamentation along the sides in white on top of blue, the tall blue minarets. This is another entranceway of the same mosque, Masjid-e-Shah. And if you look closer, that's the detail on some of the tile work, which is very iconic of Isfahani mosques. And this is a photo of a close-up of the minaret. Most of these minarets, if you look at the design, it's also geometric Arabic calligraphy. So these are the standard features of this style of architecture in Isfahan. And then we have this, which, as you can see, has the same geometric Arabic calligraphic style of ornamentation on the tall blue minarets, and the same kind of blue tile work, the honeycomb structure, though much less elaborate than the previous photographs, the same arched entranceway. And these photos are from Mumbai. One of them taken by me in 2016 and one from Google. This building is known as the Mughal Masjid. Masjid means mosque, and Mughal means, well, we'll come to that. That's what the talk is about. But if you look at the front of the mosque, you might be able to read, if you can read Persian, the inscription at the very top says Masjid-e-Iranian, which means Mosque of the Iranians. And if you look around the neighborhood, you will see various other buildings that sort of speak of Iranians, like this Iranian sweet shop, which you can't fully read, but the line in green on the right, which is partly hidden by the white light, says, come as a customer, leave as a friend. So this is the social world in Mumbai today. That is the remnant of the community building that I'm going to be talking about from the 19th and the 20th century. But a bit more about where is Mumbai and colonial Bombay, and what is the part of the world that we're talking about. If you look at Google, Google does not know where the Mosque of the Iranians is, but it does know where Mughal Masjid is. You will see that it is located at the very southern tip on the map of Mumbai. And the map of Mumbai has changed a lot in 2021 from what it was in the 20th century. So this is how the map looks now. This is Mumbai sticking out into the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. And this is a map of the island city of Bombay in 1908. Now, to give you an estimation of how much the city has grown, the map on the right is only the very southernmost bit of the map on the left. So if you can find Bandra West in the map, where you can find it on the west side, right by the ocean, where Mumbai is written, you'll see Bandra West. Just below Bandra West is where the map on the right ends. So in the period that I'm talking about, Bombay, what is now Mumbai and was then colonial Bombay, was only that little bit on the south of the present map of Mumbai. Where is Mumbai? For those who don't know, it's the capital of the western of the city of Maharashtra on the western border of India, the border with the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. And you will see two other cities, ports marked on this map in Iran in the Persian Gulf, Bandar Abbas and Bushehr. So today's talk is based on a chapter that studies migration between these two Persian Gulf ports and Mumbai. But my book in general follows transoceanic itinerancy across the Indian Ocean. So it follows three main routes. It follows the route from the Persian Gulf that I've already mentioned, the route between Aden and Bombay, and the third route between Zanzibar and Bombay. So that's why my book is called Ocean Bombay, but more about that when you actually read the book. For now, that is all of the images. Now that we have talked about, now that we have an idea of where and when we're talking about 19th and 20th centuries, we can return to the question of who, and more importantly, why. Who were the Mughals? Why are they important for a history of modern South Asia or a history of modern Mumbai? If we try to answer the question in terms of numbers, the numbers were tiny compared to the population of Bombay in the colonial era. In 1865, there were about 1,639 Iranians counted in the census. In 1901, the number of people born in Persia marked in the census was numbered at 1,901, which was only 0.4% of the population of the city of Bombay. So they're not important because of the numbers in terms of total population of the city, but they are very important for understanding community formation and border making in modern South Asia. Who were the Mughals? The shortest answer to that is that they were migrants from the Persian Gulf in the late 19th and early 20th century who came to Bombay and built mostly eateries, tea shops, and bakeries and restaurants. In Mumbai today, they are most commonly referred to as Iranis, famous for the Irani cafes, which people who are familiar with Mumbai might know about. But most Irani cafe owners in Mumbai today are Zoroastrians. Mughals were also Iranis in the sense that they came from Iran or their parents came from Iran. They were also famous for their tea shops and cafes in the city, and they arrived in Bombay in the same time as their Zoroastrian counterparts. But they were Shias themselves. And they weren't all shop owners. They were also traders and merchants, Sufis and dervishes, bookbinders and lithograph printers, actors and filmmakers, authors and political exiles. But the fuller answer to who were the Mughals is a deeper conceptual answer. And that is the question that this talk will keep coming back to, because therein lies the answer of why they're important. The name Mughal poses a relationship between people and space, a relationship between itinerant people, people on the move, and space. How did these people relate to space in the city that they inhabited? And how did other inhabitants of the city relate to them? The answer to this question, what did it mean to be Mughal, is in stark contrast to the logic of political belonging that is offered by the colonial state at the turn of the century. The idea of Mughals encapsulated multiplicity, people who were both locally familiar and associated with distant origins. But the state's idea of who belonged to Bombay, on the other hand, drew simple binaries between local and foreigner, between desirable subjects and undesirable aliens. One notion, that of the Mughals, was founded on itinerancy, the idea that people travel and that they form relationships both as individuals and as collectives based in multiple places, not singular places. The other notion, the colonial notion of rightful belonging, was founded on bordering, on drawing lines that delineated an inside and an outside. So these are the two registers that we will be comparing in the talk today, and this is the period of transition that we will be thinking about. The early 20th century, and particularly the years after the First World War, was a period of tussle and accommodation between these two contradictory forces, those of capital and empire seeking to actively subsume and subordinate those that preceded it historically. And the borders of the Indian state, as we know it now, the familiar border between land and sea that we take for granted, was constructed in the process of this tussle between the itinerant and the state. And that is why studying this community is important. This is the history of the making of a community and the borders of a nation that today's talk is going to address, and the talk will proceed in three parts. First, I will talk about Bombay as a Persianate city. What does that mean? The long history of migration between the Persian Gulf and the subcontinent, and what changed in this migration in the 19th and 20th centuries. Second, I will talk about the colonial apparatus that was generated to deal with the problem of exponentially greater travel in and out of Bombay in the late 19th century. The laws and mechanisms that were put in place to distinguish an inside from an outside and an insider from an outsider. Finally, I will conclude by explaining the terms of Mughal sociality in late colonial Bombay, largely by reading through a safarname, or a travelogue, written by a traveler to Bombay from Iran at the end of the 19th century. So, part one, Bombay as a Persianate city. For those who are not familiar with the term Persianate cities, academics use it to describe a socio-political formation that stretched across West, Central, South, and Southeast Asia, broadly from the 10th to the 18th centuries. And this entire span of land was joined not by religion or by political leadership, but by a language, New Persian, and the literary, ethical, political, and cultural sensibilities associated with this language. Between the 10th and the 19th centuries in this Persianate cosmopolis, Persian was the language of exchange across polities, used by states and administrators, poets, literateurs, courtiers, Sufis, merchants, and clerics alike. The shared language also meant shared forms of political rule and cultural norms beyond the bounds of Islam in both medieval and early modern South Asia. It meant political patronage of the Persian language, common literary and historiographical traditions, extensive travel and employment across Indo-Persian lands even before the 19th century, and shared notions of ethics, akhlaq, and social conduct, adab. As historians like Manakia and Afshin Marashi have shown deftly, the Persianate did not simply cease to exist with the arrival of colonial rule, and it continued to display marks of its own cultural sensibilities well into the 18th century. Places in Hindustan had thus been popular destinations for scholars, clerics, and administrators from Iran and Turan all through the medieval and early modern period. In the 18th century South Asia, these itinerants were known as Mughals. As Manakia writes, Mughal did not automatically connote foreignness as a total binary opposite to something totally or purely local. To quote her, as a category of persons, Mughals embodied the aporetic status of trans-regionally mobile Persians, simultaneously strangers to the particular and intimates of the universal. They could be either migrants or their descendants born in the subcontinent, that is the Indian subcontinent, often for several generations. The category Mughal was specific to the subcontinent because such people existed nowhere else. To become Mughals, migrants from Iran and Turan had to come to domains of Hindustan and stay. End quote. Mughal was therefore a category which simultaneously accommodated a notion of here and elsewhere, without pinpointing a distinct geographical or racial point of origin. In fact, origin was not something that was construed in terms of a single place, but in terms of a set of accrued places, an itinerary. And this itinerary could consist of all kinds of places: place of birth, ancestral homelands, sites of study, destinations and long passages, or locations of professional or devotional apogee. Mughal was the locally familiar social identifier that encompassed all of these places and journeys. It contained both the distant and the local. The Mughal of 19th century Bombay, my period, was a continuation of the same category of identification. My work intervenes in the period where the Persianate is conventionally deemed to have ended in the 19th century. And my argument is that this community can only be understood as having formed at the interstices of both colonial modernity and an older Persianate ethics of social conduct. This world of adab, social conduct, gave itinerants a moral imagination with which to construct and interpret the social world around them and build something that was home-like or like Iran. However, while some itinerant practices continued unchanged, a lot did change in the 19th century. There were two primarily technological advancements in this century that were responsible for an exponential increase in migration between the Persian Gulf and Bombay. The first was in the realm of steam travel. The invention of the screw propeller, compound engine, and iron plating made large-scale steam travel economically viable for the first time since the 1880s. What this meant was that migration from Iran not only expanded in numbers, but also in kind. For the first time, a lot of poor migrants from Iran, not just scholars and administrators from lineages of renown, could migrate to Bombay, looking not for prestigious appointments in courts of Persianate learning like Lucknow or Hyderabad, but simply for better employment and a better future in the booming port city of Bombay. Many of Colonial Bombay's Irani hotels that are even now popular date from this period of migration. And at this time, they were primarily responsible for feeding the city's working poor. The second technological leap of the century was in printing. Bombay became one of the leading publication and export centers for Persian printing, particularly lithographs, between 1850 and 1930. Therefore, another class of Persian migrant that became very common in Bombay in this century was the bookbinder, the lithograph press owner or publisher. Finally, in the period after the constitutional period in Iran, the constitutional revolution in Iran in 1905-1906, and Reza Shah Pahlavi's assumption of power in 1925, political exiles of various shades also found refuge in Bombay. Basically, itinerants arriving from the Persian Gulf did not all immediately cohere into one community of Persians when they arrived in Bombay. There was a huge diversity of class and religion and profession. But what they did was they significantly expanded the diversity and range of social practices of an already diverse port city. That brings us to the second part of the talk. How did the state respond to this expanded number and kind of migration? The state and itinerancy, weeding out undesirables from desirables. Steamship travel, together with the expanding network of railways and trunk roads across the Indian subcontinent, was designed to facilitate the movement of goods, people, and revenue, and the accumulation of capital towards the imperial metropole in London, or towards facilitating the extraction of labor and revenue and greater social control for the colonial state, broadly centralized in Delhi. On the one hand, these means of communication allowed the mobilization and transport of labor to locations that profited the colonial state. For example, indentured Indian laborers who were transported largely to the islands of the Caribbean in order to fill the gap in labor left by the abolition of slavery. At the same time, the communications revolution also simultaneously enabled all other kinds of itinerancy, not all kinds that the British state favored. These were the kinds of travel that the state called deviant or vagrant, and they sought to marginalize and abolish it, as Radhika Singha has written in quite great detail about. Colonial governmentality required that populations on the subcontinent be sedentarized, fixed in place, in order to be grouped into revenue-generating households. Peripatetic or itinerant ways of life that were unproductive because they did not generate revenue, for example, pack trading or religious mendicancy, were simply declared criminal in order to force itinerants into more legitimate lines of work. This project of criminalizing itinerancy by virtue of birth or by virtue of belonging to a community had commenced in the early 19th century, and it culminated in the passing of the Criminal Tribes Act in 1871, which is quite well discussed in South Asian scholarship. This principle of governance achieved two things. First, it criminalized itinerancy. If you belonged to an itinerant community by birth, you were criminal by birth. Secondly, it tethered individuals to a singularly defined community, identified either as a caste or a tribe or a religion that an individual was born into. As the numbers of people arriving into Bombay across the seas expanded after the 1880s, the city police and the provincial government became increasingly anxious to control them, and it did so by sorting and organizing these arrivals and monitoring them under two broad categories: desirable subjects, undesirable aliens. A simple classification that tied individuals to property and a state that was territorially defined. I'll explain what that means in a moment. While the Criminal Tribes Act continued to monitor and control itinerancy across the northern and northwestern landed borders of the subcontinent, a slew of new legislation was passed in the late 19th and early 20th century to reify the distinction between subject and foreigner through processes of naturalization and deportation. So broadly, think of it like this. There are two sets of processes that are happening in the colonial state at the moment. On the one hand, you have itinerants applying to be naturalized as subjects of the British Indian state, and you have the state judging whether they are desirable subjects or not. And on the other hand, you have deportations, also, by the way, often done using steamships. And these are usually people who are not associated with any fixed addresses, and they are deported as undesirable aliens. So these are the two sets of projects underway, and these are the two sets of terms by which they're identified. Desirables were usually those who had property in Bombay, and sometimes they didn't even have property, they just declared that they wanted to own property. More importantly, they were people who did not own property anywhere else. Undesirables, on the other hand, were people without fixed addresses, who were either convicted of petty crimes or sometimes simply suspected of being potentially criminal. We'll return to that later. Between the Indian Naturalization Act of 1852, the Foreigners Act of 1864, the British Nationality and Status of Alien Act 1914, and the Indian Naturalization Act of 1926, the British colonial state in India set up a regime of identification that legislated upon the status and belonging of itinerants in British India, the decision being made in the final instance on grounds of whether and where one owned property. Let me explain that with two quick examples. There are many examples in the archives, but I'll just use two exemplary ones. One of naturalization that was granted and one of naturalization that was denied. The first is of Aga Mohammed Ardakani, who applied for naturalization as a British subject in Bombay in 1927. He was described as being born in a poor but respectable family in Ardakan, which in Yazd. Yazd is a place in Iran. He was resident in Bombay for 35 years and as a manager of the Sharafat printing press at New Nagpada Road. He made a living by dealing in the printing, sale, and export of religious and literary books in Bombay and Iran. Even though he owned no property, he expressed a desire to purchase immovable property, in Bombay and was granted the rights of a subject in 1927. Pretty easy. In contrast was the case of Nasrat Khanum, the widow of a political refugee in Tehran. A political refugee from Tehran, who had lived for 5 years in Pune, close to Bombay city, and 12 years before that in Hyderabad. She applied for a certificate of naturalization as a British Indian subject in 1923, proclaiming her intention to, quote, settle down for good somewhere in British India. She had affidavits and statements from local Indian solicitors and merchants who attested to her continuous stay in India since 1960, her respectable Persian family, the regular pension that she drew from the Nizam's government in Hyderabad as a political refugee, and her being a desirable citizen. She had all the evidence she needed, including a letter from the district magistrate of Pune who said, quote, the applicant has not been convicted, nor has she been bankrupt. She is not an undesirable. It sounds funny, but this is how they judged everyone, whether they were a desirable or an undesirable. The very desirable Nasrat Khanum was nevertheless rejected from her naturalization application, not because she was not respectable in class terms, but because she owned substantial immovable property in Iran. And she in fact wanted her subjecthood in British India so that she could recover her property in Iran from illegal occupants. And in the terms of the political department of Bombay, that disqualified her for naturalization. So to use their words, quote, the possession of immovable property, particularly in the country of origin, is generally regarded as a disqualification for naturalization. And the grant of a certificate to enable the applicant to recover such property is out of the question. In internal communication, the political department further explained their justification, quote, the fact that she wants to recover her property and thereby revive her lost interest in the place of her birth disqualifies her for naturalization, end quote. Of all the forms of human attachment to places, ownership of property thus became the definitive marker of interest and the standard for ascertaining where a person belonged. If she sought to recover her property in Iran, she must belong fundamentally in Iran and not to British India. If merchants, publishers, and even tea shopkeepers, once they had earned and saved enough money to rent premises, get licenses, and open a tea shop, qualified for naturalized belonging via the property test, scores of migrants from Iran who lived in Bombay as itinerant traders, dervishes, procurers, or unsteadily employed were declared undesirables and deported by sea from British India. In the case of deportations, an individual had to first be found guilty of a crime, according to the Foreigners Act of 1864. So this is interesting because foreigners are much more intuitive of a notion to us legally these days. But in the 19th century, the foreigner only became defined at the moment of expulsion because the law did not provide the government with the right to survey all foreigners at the moment of entry. Despite the fact that someone had to be found guilty of a crime in order to be expelled and deported, the Bombay government continuously deported people either for petty crimes like theft or facilitating prostitution, sometimes even just on suspicion for begging, loitering under suspicious circumstances, or being a nuisance or a source of trouble. Where naturalized subjects' applications were distinguished by affidavits announcing their respectability, their property ownership, their stable addresses, statements, undesirables were deported, were described in police reports by their absence of stable addresses, by their physical attributes like moles and tattoos, and thumbprints on their deportation orders. So there's a very clear class difference between the naturalization documents and the deportation documents, but it isn't that simple, as I explained. It's not simply that higher class Iranis were naturalized. They were naturalized if they did not own property in Iran. So you couldn't be too rich and you could not have property in Iran. It was not until 1921 that passports were made a compulsory condition for entering British India through a port. Radhika Singh has also written in detail about the tightening of the visa regime after the First World War, and it's actually hosted by the Yale Macmillan Center. She has a very good paper on the subject. And what's interesting about her work is she points out, again, something that's not intuitive to us, which is in the period between 1919 and 1921, when the visa and passport regime was being tightened for the first time, one of the main concerns for Indians fighting for tighter border control was not immigration, who was entering the country, but emigration, because elite Indians wanted to put a stop to indentured Indian laborers because they were becoming the global face of India. Anyway, she's done brilliant work on that. What my work is interested in is the distinction between sea and land. In 1921, the Indian passport rules stipulated that, quote, subject to the provisions hereinafter contained, no person proceeding from any place outside India shall enter British India by sea, unless he is in possession of a passport, end quote. I think a lot of this language remains so in the laws today, but that is something that lawyers and professional legal historians will be able to better attest to. What I want to note here is the separation between British India and a place outside British India was first constructed in hard terms, not at the frontier between land and land in the north, the northwest, or the northeast, but at the interface between land and sea. This distinction between land frontiers and oceanic borders became explicit in a dispute between the Bombay police and the Afghan consul in Bombay in 1922. The commissioner of police in Bombay was complaining that the Afghan government was too relaxed about giving passports to fakirs or holy men who were basically beggars and who were traveling into Bombay just to beg. And it was specifically upset because there were 3 Afghan fakirs who had arrived in Bombay in 1922 via Rawalpindi, Lahore, Delhi, and Agra. So basically a northern land-based itinerary. And the police of Bombay was unhappy with that. They had entered with no money, aiming to beg and earn their way to Mecca. The police and the Bombay government complained that they hoped that the Afghan government would take up the question of the issue in Afghanistan of passports of this nature to beggars to facilitate their entry into British India. The Afghan consul in Bombay, however, tellingly responded by saying that poverty in itself was not a crime, revealing a form of thinking that considered both religious mendicancy and itinerancy much more accepted ways of life, and rendering the relation between property and the right to belong quite unobvious. I'll quote the Afghan consul's letter briefly because it is quite interesting and telling of the critique of the colonial regime of identification of belonging by property ownership. He says, I have heard these men and I have come to know that they have come here for ziyarat, that is pilgrimage and labor. If the police know that they have committed any offense, then I may be informed of the same, so that I may give you a reply. Poverty does not mean undesirableness. As a matter of fact, these men are fakirs and they have come here for labor and to earn their livelihood. What will be the grounds for their deportation? If these people and others have committed any crime, then government can do according to law. Nothing can be said before any crime is committed. The passports are in order and I certify their correctness. The Bombay political government did not approve, but had to grudgingly concede that there wasn't anything they could do here, legally speaking. They conceded internally amongst themselves that the 3 fakirs could not be deported until they actually committed a crime or joined a known band of bad characters. It added, the Bombay political department, that it was not possible to apply the same regulations on frontier crossing by land that apply to arrival by sea. A department memorandum explained that, quote, passport regulations only apply to persons coming to India by sea. And as apparently no British visa is necessary for foreigners to enter India via the frontier, it does not seem possible to prevent the entry into India of destitute foreigners under the passport regulations. This was changed in 1934 by addition of the words and land next to by sea in the Indian passport rules. But what is important is that the border as an instrument of social control in British India was thus reified first at the gateways of port cities before being generalized to the borders of the nation state more widely. This was not because the interface between land and sea provided any kind of natural border, but the opposite, in fact. The sea, a medium of travel for centuries and infinitely more crossable in the 19th century because of empire and capitalism and technology, was a major conduit for people to the shores of the Western Indian Ocean's leading port city, that is Bombay. It was the abundance of itinerants and border crossers in Bombay, populations that were unclassified, untaxed, and uncontrolled, that provoked the need for a different kind of border apparatus that would act as a filter for undesirable aliens. Simply said, the function of a border as a line that keeps a certain kind of people out and a certain kind of people in was first reified at the interface between land and sea, not between land and land. That brings us to the final section, being Mughal in 20th century Bombay, and what does that mean? In 1931, the very distinction in the use of the words Mughal and Persian revealed a telling pattern of identification. In 1931, a small-scale riot broke out where tea shops and bakeries owned by Mughals in the Bhendi Bazaar region, neighborhood of Bombay, were attacked by Sunni Muslims following an altercation. I mean, the details are not important because it was someone got drunk and picked a fight, and then there was a minor riot. What's interesting are the terms in which this riot is described in the official records. In the riot records, we note that in local parlance, the vernacular term Mughal was used much more frequently to denote a community familiar in the neighborhoods of Bhendi Bazaar and Dongri, while Persians or Persian subjects were always evoked when questions of representation came up and the states got involved, whether it was the British colonial state or the Persian state. For example, the police, whenever they wrote reports at every step, always described the owners of the vandalized tea shops as Mughals. So did the reports in the Times of India newspaper, and so did the Indian chief magistrate in Bombay, who christened the riots the Mughal Mohammedan riots, where Mughal meant Shia Irani, and Mohammedan meant Sunni Muslims from the subcontinent, from the Indian subcontinent. In contrast, the term Persian or Persian subjects were used most prolifically by the Persian consul general and other Persian ministers in representing the needs of their government's subjects to the colonial government in Delhi or to the British envoy in Tehran, and in the response of the British colonial state to these complaints. When affected Mughals in the city wrote a letter representing their own needs, they also officially called themselves Persians. In Bombay, they wrote, "The majority of the Persian community are hotel keepers, and as a community, they have always lived peacefully and have never given any trouble to the authorities or to any other communities," end quote. However, even though they describe themselves as Persian, the same letters keep slipping between the language of Persian and more local identifiers like Sistani. Sistan is a place in Iran. The quarrel began, they say, between a motor driver and one Sistani near the Subhanallah Hotel at Bhendi Bazaar. Sistani suggested a person whose lineage connected him to the Sistan region of Iran. This was a common way of identification amongst Mughal inhabitants of the city, appending a place name to one's other names as a way of denoting a lineage of belonging. And this place was often the place where the itinerant was born, but not always. It could be the place where their parents were born, or it could be the last place where they were before coming to Bombay. In the same letter, the Mughal institution of Mughals that wrote the letter to the government was called Anjumane Fatowate Yazdian Iranian, which is the Association of Yazdi Iranian Youth, or Iranians from Yazd, which is also a region in Iran. So this pattern of identification by place names, which are not the place name of Iran, was quite common in the local level. Mughal and Persian therefore signified very different but coexistent relations between people and place. The former, Mughal, was to use Manakia's words, an aporetic term of identification, which, while denoting foreignness, also created a locally familiar and specifically South Asian category of belonging for this community. To be from Iran and arrive in Bombay in the early 20th century, therefore, meant not to arrive in a completely alien place that was totally unfamiliar, but in the middle of a familiar and locally recognized community. Persian, on the other hand, took place of origin and property as the definitive markers of subjecthood, and thus political belonging. Unlike Mughal, which was a locally embedded signifier, Persian was produced by a governmental discourse on imperial subjecthood that explicitly sought to distinguish Persian from Indian. Mughals living in the city used the term Persian when it benefited them. Some Mughals were even willing to give up the title of Persian and adopt the title of British Indian when it suited them. They used the apparatus of the state to protect their own lives and properties. But simultaneously, they continued with the more locally familiar ways of referring to themselves as Sistanis or Yazdis or Tehranis or Isfahanis. The list can go on. The three registers of self-identification therefore coexisted. The official one, Persian, the local one, Mughal, and the itinerant one, Isfahani, Tehrani, Shirazi, so on. They all coexisted. It is no surprise, therefore, that the mosque built for this community was officially named Masjid Iranian, or Mosque of Iranians, but is known both popularly and even by Google Maps as Mughal Masjid. If property ownership, then, in conclusion, was the way that Mughals and Persians proved their right to belong to the colonial state, but not to each other, what was it that tied their community together in 20th century Bombay? The short answer here again is adab, or Persianate norms of social conduct. To explain what that means, I will do a brief reading of a safarnameh, or a travelogue, written by Ali ibn Hussein Waqar al-Mulk, who was a traveler from Iran to various parts of Hindustan, but he started with Bombay, and he traveled at the very end of the 19th century. His book is called Jam-e Jam, Tarikh Hindustan, which means world-revealing goblet, and the history of Hindustan. I take the translation of Jam-e Jam as the world-revealing goblet from the incredible work of Zainab Azerbaijan, who is working on a geographical Persian lithograph from earlier in the 19th century. The lithograph that I'm discussing today quite possibly follows in the same tradition, combining geography, history, and travelogue. And in my book, I discuss both this text and the genre in greater detail. For now, I'll just talk about Waqar al-Mulk's description of life for Irani Shias in Bombay. In his description, conflict and violence are far from absent. He describes some communities, such as Konkani Sunni Muslims, who he calls Kukni, as harboring unmitigated hatred towards Shias, while others, such as the Memons, who he describes as very friendly towards Shias. The Hindus of Hindustan he describes as foolish, ahmak, and dirty, and yet he is not interested in the theological differences between the various groups he describes. He comments on various habits and beliefs that he finds strange, but concludes that, quote, the beliefs of the people of Iran and Hind do not have many differences from one another, end quote. Hindustan, or Bombay in particular, therefore, was not rendered a strange or unfamiliar place to Waqar al-Mulk by virtue of the divergent religious beliefs of its many communities. People who were unfamiliar in terms of religion in Iran could be related to in terms of their etiquette, adab, customs, rusumat, and education, tarbiyat, or lack thereof. He's very keen to mention when people are bi-tarbiyat, without education, not cultured. In other words, what produced in great part a sense of being at home for the Irani Shia migrant in the diverse milieu of 19th and 20th century Bombay was the right adab and attitude towards Shias. This sense of homeliness and spaces being like Iran in Bombay were materially produced by the appropriate adab of wealthy merchants and Iranian expatriates. Merchants like Haji Muhammad Hussain Shirazi and religious personalities like the Aga Khan, who was the leader of the Ismaili community and himself an exile from Iran. Their rich people like this were expected to display their virtuous manhood by means of their open-handed generosity to others who were not so affluent. The deceased Shirazi merchant Haji Muhammad Hussain, in the words of Waqar al-Mulk, was one of the revered merchants of Iran, and he built a mosque in Bombay, the mosque whose photos we have seen, in the manner of Iranian mosques, which Waqar al-Mulk describes in superlative terms, describing the beauty in the mosque, the beauty of the mosque and its features. He said that few other mosques of such brightness and ornamentation were built in that time in all the cities of Hindustan and Iran. While the Muslims of Bombay had built nearly 2,000 heavenly mosques in the city, none matched or would ever match this mosque in spirit and purity. Next to this, he wrote, the deceased Aga Khan had constructed a hammam, or a public bath, which still exists today, by the way, but I haven't been given access to it, but I think it exists. This hammam was the exclusive Iranian-style hammam in the city, in the words of Waqar al-Mulk. The generosity of these revered Persian figures was therefore central to the reproduction of familiar built spaces for all Irani migrants in the cities, but particularly for Shias. While this network of familiar support was largely framed by religious affiliation, its benefits did not only accrue to Irani Shias. The Mehman Khanas, or the guest houses built by Aga Khan, were reserved for the use of all travelers from Iran in need of lodging. Waqar al-Mulk profusely describes Aga Khan's generosity to his guests. On the one hand, his house was, quote, a refuge and shelter for all strangers and travelers from Iran. His Mehman Khanas, the guest houses, had every provision that anyone arriving from Iran, the highest or the lowest, could want for their comfort. On the one hand, the man personally cared about his guests' well-being. On the other, he visited their quarters at sunrise every day and provided for the expenses of every guest, including a sum for the gifts of their families. No traveler ever had less than 50 tomans a day for lunch and dinner. And in the course of a year, the Aga Khan spent more than 30,000 tomans in gifts and tips, bazl or bakshish. Because of this open-handed, noble behavior, travelers from Iran and Bombay felt at home. To end with Waqar al-Mulk's own words, even if a person spends time in his house, in the Aga Khan's house, for a period of 1 year, he never feels sad. Instead, time passes as if in their own homes, manzil, and homelands, vatan. The entire text by Waqar al-Mulk, and particularly the section on Bombay, must be read as a performance of appropriate adab. If the right adab from a wealthy host was his unparalleled hospitality, the correct adab from the guest was to match him in the expression of gratitude and praise. In Waqar al-Mulk's narrative, there emerges a picture of a thriving social life for Iranian migrants in 19th century Bombay, centered around definite locations: the Mughal Masjid in Dongri, the hammam or bathhouse next to it, the Aga Khan's house and guest houses, the 3 takiyas or mourning halls occupied during Muharram, all provided for by the generosity of others and not owned or maintained by the people who actually lived there. In conclusion, this then was a cultural world that was much more at home with itinerancy than the British colonial state, and with forms of social dependence and belonging not made legible in the language of property, but other universal norms of comportment and culture. Where the state sought to deport beggars, the Musafir Khanas or travelers' lodges gave shelter to Sufis, holy men, beggars, and all kinds of people with no stable means of income. Indeed, it can be said that the ideal adab enabled itinerant lifestyles across the Persianate sphere, and in late 19th, early 20th century Bombay, these norms still governed habits of itinerancy. At the turn of the 20th century, the colonial state was engaged in forging increasingly policed state borders and tethering individuals either to the community that could be held responsible for their behavior or criminalized en masse, or by tethering individuals to property that could be taxed, or by tethering them to a contract by which labor could be extracted from them. Migrants from the Persian Gulf living in Bombay at the time recognized and used the state's apparatus for securing their own lives and property in Bombay city when they had property. Simultaneously, however, a much wider range of itinerants from Iran continued to inhabit and be welcomed into the city, as older Persianate norms of social interaction resisted the colonial common sense that property definitively roots people in place. After the First World War, with the tightening of the border regime and eventually with the decolonization and the formation of new nation states, the strains of the Persianate gradually faded and many Mughals left Bombay, but not all. Many Mughals still remain in Bombay city. They do still congregate at the Mughal Masjid, which is very much an alive institution, and new institutions have grown up around them. Many people live there who are currently citizens of India, are citizens of Iran, but have overseas citizens of India cards. And they maintain this itinerant lifestyle of moving back and forth between Iran and Bombay. But the memory of Mughal Iranis have faded from mainstream memory of both Mumbai as a city and India as a country. Today, Irani appears as synonymous with Parsi in popular culture. Irani cafes are mostly owned by Irani Parsis or Zoroastrians, even though once many of them were owned by Irani Mughals. And migrants from Iran can today only be conceived through the language of Iranians in India, and certainly nothing as non-binary and pre-modern seeming as Mughal, which continues to be associated solely with the likes of Akbar and Aurangzeb. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhattacharya. We are now open for questions, so feel free to post it in the Q&A section, or if you'd like to sort of say it out, if you raise your hand, I could enable you to speak. And as we gather questions, I wanted to sort of invite you to speak a little bit about the experience of thinking about Bombay or doing sort of research that is ethnography and archival about Bombay in other spaces, particularly spaces like Birmingham and Tehran. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. To do research about this particular route of itinerancy, my places were Mumbai's archives in Delhi, the National Archives, and in Tehran. I also tried to find some things in Isfahan, but it was difficult. Birmingham and other places in London were primarily used for the other routes, which is for the route between Aden and the route with Zanzibar. So I'll just speak about the experience regarding Iran. It was simultaneously difficult and fantastic. And I think it's quite crucial to begin methodologically from the point of view that if we are going to write the history of a city like Bombay, which is today an Indian city, but for a good period of its history was not simply an Indian city, it was an Indian Ocean port city. And therefore, if we're going to write the history of that city, we must not simply begin with Indian archives. Once you do that, the process becomes quite messy because it's difficult to find archives. For example, there are the Maharashtra State Archives are quite bad at keeping a lot of Persian literature, for example, that was published here. There are journals, there are newspapers that Irani migrants and exiles printed that I haven't been able to find in Mumbai. But then I have found all kinds of things in Tehran and Isfahan, many of which I'm not even sure are relevant. But because Bombay was such a big printing center for Persian literature, there is an endless store of lithographs and printed Persian books and manuscripts in Isfahan. But it's also not just books. The film archive in Tehran is an incredible archive. It's the most organized encyclopedic collection of cultural production. And they also provide a lot of insight into a later period of Irani migration in the 30s when cinema becomes a big technological innovation. So yeah, I think it's methodologically the most important thing that one can do when writing the history of social spaces that do not owe their existence to the nation state, but were in fact part of the process of the making of the borders of the nation state.
Thank you, Tanya. There's now quite a long queue, so I'm going to invite Kelvin Nig to ask his question directly. Mm-hmm. Kelvin, you can speak.
Hi, Tanya. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I apologize for the noise. I am on a train. I have two quick questions, but before that, let me just say how much I'm looking forward to your book. The first question is about how it's perhaps situating this in relation to histories of Indian Ocean migration. So a recurrent theme when you're talking about the Hadrami or the Chinese or Cheta diasporas is that this is a very male phenomenon. On the other hand, the work of Manakia on adab has emphasized the sort of gendered socially reproductive dimensions of adab as a form of social comportment or as a sort of performance of etiquette. So I guess I just wanted to invite you to speak a bit on whether there was a gender dimension to the phenomenon of migration itinerancy among the Iranis in Bombay, and in what way did this sort of familial gendered sociality inform adab among the Mughals in Bombay? The second question, which is perhaps more general in scope, is how might one situate these forms of migration in relation to structural transformations in political economy? Here I'm thinking about the growing importance of industrial capital over merchant capital, and how the Mughals in Bombay responded to that shift. Yeah, but thank you so much for the presentation. I really learned a lot from your talk.
Thank you, Kevin. 1 second. All right. Gendered itinerancy and adab, it's one of the big questions that confronted me when I set out to do research on 19th century itinerants in Bombay. After about 8 months of research in the archives, it would seem as if women didn't exist almost. It's almost like the world was run only by men, if you're looking for itinerants specifically. That's because of the nature of archives and colonial records. But women certainly appear. In my book project, it appears in a final chapter, the period of the 30s that I was referring to earlier. And the reason women finally start appearing as subjects of history is because they become indispensable to the world of cinema. I think the talk next week is going to talk about Bombay in this period, and Devashree Mukherjee talks about the importance of the female figure of the star, which is also very important in my research, because Bombay is actually the place where early Persian sound cinema is made, and the actors for these movies were very often recruited from amongst Irani migrants in the city. The first Iranian Muslim woman to unveil on screen in Dukhtar-e-Lor was a migrant in the city, and I write about her in the last chapter of my book. So the gendered aspect of itinerants, women were certainly migrating. All of the migrants that we talk about, especially if you, I mean, it's hard to tell from the archives, but if you do interviews of Mughals in the city today, many people will tell you how the grandfather came first and then he went back and got married and brought back his wife. That is a very common story. You can see that in the archives as well. When Irani migrants are applying for naturalization as citizens, one of the things the state cares about is whether they're married or not. And if they're not married, who do they want to marry? So they get very concerned if someone says, I'm going back to Iran to get married. There is evidence where the state says, well, we'll wait for you to come back and then we'll give you the citizenship, the subjecthood. So who you marry is also treated by the state as a marker of belonging. But women appear not as authors or participants in the adab themselves in the sources that I have been able to access. I haven't, for example, found any books authored by female Irani migrants in the late 19th or early 20th century to Bombay. If you know of any, I'd be delighted to learn. I've tried. It's a big subject, but women are certainly important in the terms that male migrants use to construct their own identities. So just to quote one example, there is a whole group of Irani migrants that the British state at one point wants to deport as criminal, and they arrest all the men. And then the women write a petition saying our men are innocent, so on and so forth. But if you look at the names, the way they're listed, the men all have longer names in terms of like son of so and with place names, whereas the women are only listed by their first name appended to the names of their husbands. So in colonial archives, that's how women appear, as like secondary modes of identification of the primary identities of the male itinerants. But in a later period, in the decade of the 30s, where even outside of itinerants, women burst into the workplace, there women become an interesting subject. Regarding the changing political economy of Bombay, that is a big, substantial part of my book. I look more at merchant capitalism, and that is why Port City to Mill City. I don't talk as much in detail about the Mill City, especially because when most of the histories of Bombay and labor in Bombay are interested in mills and mill workers, the part that we don't know about is the port city and port workers and merchant capital. So I focus a lot on port workers, and an interesting detail about how the changing role of capitalism also changes the way in which people relate to space comes up in the case of Aden and migration with Aden, because you will find in my book a group of merchants who are from Bombay who also live in Aden, who claim that Aden belongs to Bombay. And this is a logic of belonging. It's not simply that they belong to Aden, but that Aden belongs to them. And this logic of belonging, this way of relating to space, is born because of a particular logic of capital, which sees space as a means of accumulation and not as any other form of attachment to space. That's another chapter of the book, but I can talk more about it later.
I'm going to invite Deepthi to ask a question.
Hi. I was wondering if you could comment on whether these individuals brought their music with them to Bombay, and how that influenced the Gharana tradition in Bombay.
Thank you so much. I would love to answer the question, but I'm the most musically untrained person. So I would unfortunately not have anything to say about the Gharana tradition. The musical tradition that I know a bit more about in the context of my book is about Siddhis, which is the community that forms at the ends of the route of travel between Zanzibar and Bombay. Much more is written, but I know that not from knowing anything about music myself, but from reading very good ethnographic, ethnomusical literature on Siddhi drumming and healing practices and how they combine various musical instruments and practices from the African continent, from Arabia, and from South Asia. So that is an extremely rich and unique musical tradition. I really don't know much about the Irani musical traditions that have continued here. I know that as at the interface of these two things, Iran and Siddhi, there is a very famous Afro-Iranian performer who I have personally seen in New York, but cannot remember the name of. So there's almost certainly a lot there in terms of music, but I don't really know so much about the musical traditions. What I do know is that a lot of ritual performances during Muharram are obviously carried on from Iran, and Muharram continues to this day to be a big an important event in the city. And the act of mourning, Roozedari, it's described in the lithograph that I talk about, and it was described by one of the women I spoke to at Najafi House in Mumbai today. It is, I want to go and participate and actually do a sort of ethnographic observation of Muharram rituals themselves, which I have been invited to, but it's always during term time, so I haven't been able to go. But Sarovar Zaidi has done good work on Muharram in the Irani community of Mumbai today. So I think you would find something there, not directly about music, but about taziyas and like the performances of the reenactment of the events of Karbala through poetry and ritualized mourning. So that's a good person to read for answers to that question.
I'm going to invite Caleb to speak. Caleb is a first year at Yale, taking a class in Bombay, and they just read Nile Green, Bombay Islam by happy coincidence this morning. Caleb.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was amazing. I was just wondering, I was really interested in the Persianate societies. You kind of said they were unified in their language. In what other ways were they unified? You said they sort of had similar cultural sensibilities. What does that really mean? I'm just curious.
Sure. I will give
if I could just piggyback, there's another question by an anonymous attendee which ties in, and they ask, to what extent do the norms of adab and akhlaq represent idealized utopian imaginaries as opposed to descriptions of actual social reality that govern everyday social relationships within this community? Thanks.
That's really very interesting. To answer the first question, I will give a brief answer, but there's a huge world of literature on this subject, which you should definitely read. A lot of my answers to the questions that I found in the archives came to me from this body of literature, but not fully. It did not answer everything, but it did provide a rubric for explaining the things that I was reading and the sources I was finding. So the concept of the Persianate society was coined by Marshall Hudson, but it has expanded a lot since then. And it goes up as late. So in the idea of Marshall Hudson, the idea was the Persianate broadly overlapped with the Islamicate, but much later research on the concept of the Persianate by, as I said, Afshin Marashi and Manakia suggests that, and Richard Eaton and lots of other people will talk about shared forms of political rule and cultural comportment that go beyond Islam. So, for example, if you look at the Dakhani sultanates in South Asia, or if you forget the sultanates because they were Islamic, if you look at the Vijayanagar kingdom and look at architecture, and you see the ways in which they're similar to architecture from the Persianate world. And Richard Eaton is a very good person to read for works about that. So forms of architecture that translate, basically the idea of the Persianate cosmopolis is that the language of Persian becomes the language of power. So vast swaths of land that are not united either by religion or by political leadership all come to see Persian as the language of power. Now, some of this might be familiar to you. When the British came to South Asia, they saw language as the Persian as the language of power. They issued coins in Persian because they were imitating the Mughal language of power. Another feature of the Mughal Persianate world that's often pointed out is that more Persian language literature books were printed in Mughal South Asia than were printed in Safavid Iran. I mean, I hope that piece of information is correct, but I think it is. The idea is that the use of Persian and cultural production around the language of Persian, both literary, architectural, musical, and political, extended across various lands and various centuries. But it is conventionally deemed to have ended with the arrival of colonialism, and the most recent research from the likes of Manakia argues that it did not end in the 16th century. It continues well into the 18th century. And my work suggests that it kind of continues into the 19th as well. Not because I set out to make that argument, but because I found these texts and I found Mughal, and Mughal was everywhere, and I didn't know what Mughal was. And it was actually Manakia's literature explaining what Mughal was in the 18th century that gave me the answer. Regarding the second question of how much were these ideals forms and, sorry.
It's in the answered section. It's the second typed question there from an anonymous.
Yeah. How much were these idealized utopian forms as opposed to real descriptions of social life? I've often thought about this question, especially when I was taking classes with Manakia, because the world and the idea of adab as the form that sort of unites the Persianate cultural imaginary is developed from books written by clerics and men of letters. How much is that something in practice is very difficult to tell, because as a historian, the question of sources. So there are a few things that we can do. The one I tried was to try and combine some kind of ethno-historical method in reading with the sources. I haven't written about this in my book, but I want to write about it in an article on method. My travel to Iran was very much an immersion in what I read of as adab. I mean, simple English word of hospitality does not suffice to describe the forms in which people relate to guests and the ways in which norms of comportment is really a good way of describing how people relate to people who arrive from a different place, especially if you're Hindi or Indian. But I don't use that in my scholarly manuscript because I cannot intellectually directly provide that as evidence for what was happening in the 20th century. So I use the texts that are available to describe idealized forms, and I will follow up with the more sort of ethno-historical article about method and how looking at the behavior of the people with whom we talk today can be used as a way of reflecting on the sources from the period. But in the absence of, basically what I've tried to do by bringing in the discussion of Persianate in this talk is to try and push beyond the sort of class barrier that you are pointing out here in this question. The point is, a lot that we know about the Persianate comes from books that have been written by men of letters talking about gender and education. And the migrants from the Persian Gulf that I study in the 19th century are largely not men of letters. So I've tried to push into the world of sociality and read the two side by side.
Amna Qayyum.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for this wonderfully rich talk. So you mentioned this sort of Mughal and Muhammadan divide, which exists in more official registers, sometimes based on a religious and spatial difference, and in many times grounded in political economy. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the varied landscape of Shiite Islam within Bombay. And in particular, I'm thinking about something you spoke briefly about towards the end of your talk, and which is the Aga Khan's move to Bombay in the mid-19th century. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the extent to which this sort of shapes the contours of Shiite community formation, and if you can think a little bit more about what it means for Bombay to emerge as a particular space where claims to religious authority can be staged for Ismaili communities, not only in Bombay, but also other spaces in British India and across the Indian Ocean.
Thank you. That's a very good question, and not for no reason. There's very good writing, especially on the question of Ismailis and the role both that Bombay plays as a space and that the world of colonial law plays by offering community of Ismailis sort of new grounds and new languages for defining the identity of the community. I will not go into talking much about Ismailis just because it's not my area of specialization, but what I will talk about, I mean, what I know is from the work of people like Tina Purohit. So you should read her work on Shia Islam. If you haven't already, you may well have. What I find interesting in my work is, so speaking of community, I chose, when I frame my research, to not frame community in terms of religion. In fact, to not even start with community as a given. So if you look at something like Bombay Islam, for example, which treats a very similar terrain, but its defining parameters is Islam or different kinds of Islam. My research does not begin nor ends with Islam. It does not begin with religion at all. What it begins with is space. So as I showed in the map earlier, it uses routes of travel and itinerancy, and then it tries to see how people who moved along these routes came to form collective social identities that in English we broadly shorthand as community. So my work, my book actually is pushing against the idea of community itself, and what does a community mean? And what are the different registers in which communities are being created? So one register is the colonial register, and migrants use the colonial register. So it's not simply that this is something that's coming from the top that is imposed and we have nothing to do with it. As we know with Ismailis and the famous case that they fought and won, definition of who an Ismaili is and who the rightful leader of the Ismaili community depended largely on colonial law. So migrants used colonial law, but that was not the only register in which community was defined. Community was also defined through other concepts. And something like a Mughal, the concept of a Mughal is a contribution to try and understand these other concepts that get buried under the colonial registers, because the latter is the one that predominates today. Speaking of Shia Islam and the various kinds of Shias, the reason I say this is because I wasn't looking for Shias in Bombay, but in the course of studying Mughals and Shia Iranis, I came across very interesting references. The lithograph that I talk about, for example, has a very interesting way of talking about Ismailis. So remember how I said that he profusely praises Aga Khan, who's the leader of the Ismailis, because of his extreme generosity and perfect adab. To be clear, he doesn't use the word adab. I'm using that word to describe all the other aspects that he does describe. Like in a good 12 pages about Bombay, 6 pages or something is about the Aga Khan. So it's not for nothing that he thinks this person is important. But he doesn't think much of the Ismailis. He does not think very much of their faith. As I said, he sort of describes it in a slightly sardonic way. He says, these Ismailis come from all over the world, from as far as Zanzibar, and they come here to visit the Aga Khan's house, and they circumambulate his house as though that is a pilgrimage, and then they leave. So you could see that as a literal description, or you could see that as a slightly like sardonic description. He does not speak of Ismaili faith as very important or with a great deal of nuance or respect. But when he starts talking about Aga Khan, the register shifts completely. And it is interesting because at the time that Bakr al-Mulk is visiting Bombay, Aga Khan is in conflict with Islamic authority in Iran because he's perceived as a challenge to Twelver Shiism. So even though he is theologically speaking a critic of Twelver Shiism, a visitor from Iran like Bakr al-Mulk has no problem recognizing in him norms of cultural conduct that he approves and appreciates as the right forms of conduct, for example. So yeah, I hope that's interesting.
Akshay Tanka, who's I think using Vatsal's account right now. Akshay, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for that, Rohit. Tanya, thanks for sharing your research. That was really fascinating. And I was wondering if, thinking with your reference to the bazaars, Bhendi Bazaar in particular, where you mentioned the members of this community, this itinerant community work, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of the colonial informal economy in shaping the sense of itinerancy associated with the community in the 19th and 20th century. And I'm thinking specifically, wondering about the question of what sense of mobility specifies this itinerancy in ways that perhaps it wasn't earlier, say perhaps in the 18th century. So, what is the role of the kinds of work that they do in the bazaar, the print culture? What are the other kinds of work that these members of the Mughal community that you're highlighting here did, and to what extent is the colonially constituted informal economy shaping that sense of itinerancy, both as a sense of refuge and perhaps also as a sense of vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I haven't specifically used the notion of the informal economy because a lot of the migrants who come in fit in different nooks and crannies of the economy. But you're right that the sense of opportunity that comes to be associated with Bombay in this period, and not just migrants from the Persian Gulf, but for migrants from all across the Indian Ocean, is a feature, a factor of the life of Bombay as a colonial port city. And in fact, that is what this research sort of rests on, the idea that Bombay attracted itinerants from all over the subcontinent, by the way. Like majority of the itinerants in Bombay city throughout the 19th and 20th century were from all over the subcontinent. But they were also from, a small percentage was also from across the ocean. And as I said, the main change in the nature of itinerancy from the Persian Gulf was in volume and social class. So because of the advancements in steam travel and in printing culture and the sort of advancements in Persian printing in particular in Bombay, larger numbers of Persians started coming into Bombay, and they stopped being simply from the educated elite and became much more just poor peasants, people out of jobs. If you speak to people in Mumbai today who are of the Mughal community, sometimes people will tell you stories that suggest that traveling to Bombay was so easy. One person's story was that my grandfather was a child and he overheard his parents having a conversation about having another kid, and they thought they didn't love him anymore. So he took a boat and went to Bombay. Now the point is not whether this story is true, it may well have been or not, but the point is that Bombay was considered just that close to Bushehr or Bandar Abbas, and like leaving was not really as much of a big deal as we would imagine now. And the reason it was so is because there was a thriving community of hotel keepers, what we call hotels in India. To like any non-South Asianist audiences here, these weren't hotels in the sense that people didn't live there. They're restaurants or small eateries. To me, after having gone to Iran, it also totally makes sense that poor migrants looking for jobs in Bombay would open bakeries, because Iranian baked goods and tea are, well, up the best. So they opened bakeries and they opened tea shops and they opened restaurants. That was the biggest thing that Irani migrants in the city were, both Shia and Zoroastrian, were engaged in. And the second thing that they did was printing. Wouldn't describe printing as part of the informal economy. The person who's done very good work on the importance of printing and the role that played in the growth of a cosmopolitan Islamic Indian Ocean world is Niall Green. Bombay Islam talks at length about the importance of printing and the many lithographs. He goes in detail into several lithographs that were published in Bombay at the time and exported from Bombay back to Iran and to other parts of the Indian Ocean Islamic world. So yeah, I think those were the professions. I'm not sure if that answers your question about the informal economy, but maybe I misunderstood.
Thank you so much, Tanya. So unless there are no other questions, I might sort of use my privilege as chair to come in for a second one. I was really struck in the ways in which you showed through the second half of your talk how the colonial state created distinctions between land and sea when they're looking at migrants. And to what extent do you sense that the people navigating the colonial state were aware of these legal requirements? Were they trying to hide or make visible property just to be able to establish these claims? Or is it more a story of people being caught in a web of bureaucracy that they don't understand?
Yeah, I love that question because there are so many good stories that I was hoping I would have an opportunity to tell. It is a combination of both. It certainly is a sense of expanding bureaucracy very often, but as happens, a sort of supportive mechanism arose alongside to facilitate people's entry into this world of bureaucracy. So if you look at naturalization applications, they're all formulaic, and clearly they're being processed by these lawyers who have figured out how to write and what the standard format of applications are. If you're looking at petitions from Iranis to the government, they're also formulaic and very often not written by them. It's clearly being written by someone who's probably a typist somewhere who knows how to type in English because the signature is in Persian. And it is very interesting to, so you have both. You have the ride of like a sprawling bureaucratic network, which actually does not adequately control what it is seeking to control. So what also often happens is sometimes there are funny stories where the Bombay government deports someone. And as I said, the deporting documents sort of tries to identify them by virtue of moles and tattoos and scars and their thumbprints. And sometimes the people they deport them by sea, they just come back. And it's hilarious to see the state trying to sort of control and find and sort of recognize that they're deporting the same person again. And it's very difficult to sort of enforce the bureaucracy fully in place, but the early 20th century is the period when the state is sort of trying to do and is becoming more and more onerous and is becoming better at it, frankly, but it's still not foolproof. And yeah, there was another story. Now I forget which one it was.
Thank you so much. We've put you on the dock for almost an hour and a half now. And we're very grateful for your agreeing to come and start off our series. Thanks to the audience members and in particular to Amar and Ryan for helping put this together. We return next week with another talk on Bombay, but this time at noon, where we'll be looking, we have a book panel on Soumya Roy's new book on the waste pickers of Bombay. It's called Castaway Mountain on the big garbage dump. So thank you again. The talk will be archived and put onto Facebook if you want to watch it later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure.